we're going to look this morning at the history of Christian missions. One of the points we like to stress as we teach missiology is that the study of missions is an integrative discipline. Adam Greenway indicated last night, you want to establish all of your foundations in Scripture and theology. What missions does is take what you learn and apply it, but it bases it on sort of all of the other disciplines of the Christian faith. And we've looked at issues of biblical theology. We've looked at issues of cultural anthropology. We're not going to look at the issue of church history, looking at it through a missiological lens. Now, there are some of you I know who find that really exciting, and some of you who have to stifle a yawn. There are some of you who share, a godly perspective that history is probably the most exciting thing you could possibly study. And then there are others of you who are like Henry Ford, who famously said, history is bunk. So the question has to come up, why do we do this? Why do we study missions history? The first reason, of course, is simply that history is fun. And if you do not think history is fun, then you have a teacher or a professor somewhere back in your heritage who needs to be shot. Because if they didn't make it fun, then, you have to, in my mind, you have to go out of your way to make history not fun. Sadly, it is often done. But more to the point for us, history is essential to understanding the present. It helps us not just to know where we are, but how we got here. And that helps us to understand the trajectories that lead us into the future. Most of the world is much more conscious of the present significance of the past than Americans are. My kids grew up in Central Asia. They grew up in a city where we could stand on the roof of our apartment building and see a cathedral that had been turned into a mosque. It was the new building of that one, so it was built in the 530s. They lived just up the hill from where the Council of Chalcedon had taken place. To my kids, history is living. It is normal and part of their lives. To them, the words American history are an oxymoron. America isn't old enough to have history. I still remember one time we were furloughing in Washington, D.C. Capitol Hill Church was our host. And one of the guys at the church, who was a staff member on Capitol Hill, took us for a personal private tour of the U.S. Capitol building. My daughter was 12 years old at the time. And when the tour was over, he looked at her and said, well, what did you think? And her response was, yeah, it's not bad for such a young building. And that really was sort of the perspective she brought to the whole thing. Because we don't have much history, we're not really conscious of the significance of history. But for example, a lot of what's going on in the Balkans right now, the conflict between the Albanians and the Serbs in Kosovo, is very much a direct result of a battle that happened in the 1380s. And that battle in the 1380s is living reality for those people. Most of the world just understands that it doesn't just matter where we are, it matters how we got here. And we cannot really understand the present without understanding the past. History also teaches us a lot. We learn both from what our ancestors did well and from what they did poorly. There's simply no sense in repeating past mistakes, and yet we have a habit of doing that, and especially so if we refuse to look at what's gone before. This is true, I would say, in terms of historical theology. It's been interesting to spend my life around people who are discovering and exploring the gospel for the very first time, and what I've realized is that there are no new heresies under the sun. That most heresies are prevalent not because they're completely out to lunch, but because they start with something biblical and go the wrong way with it. And believers today can do exactly the same things. There's no point in not learning what our ancestors went through and the blind alleys it can lead you down. The history of missions also teaches us how the gospel got to us and our debts to missions throughout the ages. I just want to ask a question. How many of you are of Jewish Christian extraction? If you are of Jewish Christian extraction, raise your hand. Okay, one person. Even you heard the gospel as a result of missionaries. All the rest of us most emphatically heard the gospel as a result of missionaries. Had it not been for people willing to cross cultural barriers and geographic barriers to take the gospel to those who had never heard it, the gospel would never have left Palestine, and there would be no non-Palestinian Jewish Christians in the world. You are a believer. You will be in heaven, instrumentally speaking, because of missionaries. And without them, you yourself would not be saved. Now, at the same time, the history of missions reminds us of the fallibility of fallen people. We're going to see a lot of mistakes made along the way. It teaches us humility and sobriety as we look at our own situation. When you understand how many times in the past either we have totally failed to take advantage of an opportunity, or we have done so in a way that has set the work back rather than advancing it, it teaches us hopefully to be a little more cautious and prayerful about the things that we do. But I think most of all, the history of missions displays the glory of God at work through fallible people. Other than Jesus, everyone who has ever preached the gospel has been a sinner and has had serious flaws, and yet God has used fallible people like us to spread the gospel more widely than it has ever been before in history. So with that in mind, let's go through the way the gospel spread out from Jerusalem. I'm going to probably concentrate a little more on recent times because that gives us a solid understanding of where we stand today. But you're very well aware of the fact that the gospel began spreading instantly. At Pentecost, if you look through the list of peoples who were present and then plot them on a map, you begin to realize that right off the bat, God was up to spreading the gospel way beyond where it currently existed. And so we read that there were Parthians and Medes and Elamites at Pentecost in Jerusalem. Those come from modern-day Iran. That there were Mesopotamians, that's modern-day Iraq and parts of eastern Turkey. The Judeans, modern-day Israel and Palestine. Those peoples from Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, and Pamphylia are from my old neck of the woods. Those are people from modern-day Turkey. There are people from Egypt and Libya in North Africa. There were people from Rome in Europe. There were people from the island of Crete. There were people from Arabia. Now, the very presence of those people was a consequence of the sovereign activity of God in setting the stage for the spread of the gospel even before Jesus was born. God is the master of taking what we do bad and bringing good out of it. So the children of Israel rebelled against God. He judged them through the invasion of the Babylonians and the scattering of the Israelites across the ancient world, and that then became a framework in which the gospel could spread rapidly. The reason you have all of these peoples from places as far afield as Italy on one side and Arabia and Iran on the other side is they were Jews or Jewish converts who came from those areas because those were the places to which the Jewish people had been scattered. As a result, there were outposts of the knowledge of the God of Israel all across the ancient world. And as we read about the New Testament spread of the gospel, we realize that really was the framework God used, that there's a very real sense in which a lot of the prep work had been done for the sharing of the gospel through the presence of the synagogue and the preaching of the law. One of the major issues we face in any sort of mission work is dealing with foundational worldview issues that either make the gospel intelligible or completely unintelligible. And so if you do not understand what the Bible is talking about when it talks about God and humanity and sin and sacrifice, then a simple presentation of the core gospel message will literally be unintelligible to you. Well, God had spread the knowledge of himself literally all across the ancient world. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, there were Jewish communities. And those Jewish communities had not only themselves preserved the knowledge of God and seen some conversions. There were some Gentiles who were converted to the Jewish faith. Perhaps more significantly, there were groups of God-fearers around them. Gentiles who were attracted to the God of Israel, but unwilling to go through the formal process of conversion, and not only the physical pain that could involve for a man, but also the social ostracism and alienation that could cause with your family. So you had all these people who were attracted to God, not willing to become Jewish, some understanding of who God is and what God requires. And you had that as a fertile seedbed for the spread of the gospel in the ancient world. So right off the bat, you have people from that diaspora who have come together to Jerusalem as a result of the Feast of Pentecost. They heard the message. Some of them may have stayed, but we're told that they were visitors to Jerusalem. And so undoubtedly, many of them went back. And one of the most significant factors about New Testament missions is that we have no clue who founded most of the churches. For the most part, the spread of the gospel in the ancient world was a result of nameless people who were simply faithful disciples of Jesus who had heard the good news and took it with them where they went. So right off the bat, we have a fairly astonishing spread of the gospel, at least within a Hellenistic Jewish synagogue setting, potentially from Rome as far as Iran and Arabia. Significantly, one of those places is Rome, and as far back as we can trace in the New Testament, there's a church in Rome, and yet we have no idea who started it, and it almost certainly was not the work of an apostle. Now, in the aftermath of the stoning of Stephen, you will remember that the disciples were scattered all over Judea and Samaria. Primarily, they spoke to Jews, but first Philip and then Peter and John ministered in Samaria, and that was sort of the first breaking of a barrier. So initially, you have Jews in Jerusalem. But Jesus had said it would be in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world. So with the spread of the gospel to Samaria, you not only have a geographic spread, you have a significant barrier broken. Given the strength of prejudice between Samaritans and Jews, this was a major step forward. Then in Antioch, men from Cyprus and Cyrene spoke also to Gentiles. And you have the spread beyond the Jewish nation. It had started with Cornelius in Caesarea, and then you had the beginnings of Gentile churches and of mixed Gentile-Jewish churches. In Barnabas and Paul's first missionary journey, you have them working in Cyprus and in what is now modern-day Turkey. Then second journey, Barnabas and Mark went back to Cyprus. Paul and Silas did more work in what is now Turkey and then spread over into Greece in Europe. Paul's third missionary journey, you have the same territory covered. Apparently at some point, not recorded by Luke, Paul also went up to modern-day Yugoslavia. He talks about going as far as Illyricum in Romans chapter 15, and that is the Croatian coastland. Meanwhile, we know from the start there was a church in Rome. We also know from early on that there was a church in Alexandria in modern-day Egypt. So that's just the stuff we know of within the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, the gospel went east as well as west at the same time, stuff we think less about. But very early on, we have evidences of Christianity in the town of Edessa. It's modern-day Şanlıurfa in Upper Mesopotamia in Turkey. We have the gospel going to Persia and the gospel going to India. Church tradition says, for instance, that the Apostle Thomas went through Iran and modern-day Pakistan and took the gospel all the way to South India. There is a community of people calling themselves Christians in South India who date themselves back to the Apostle Thomas. They actually call themselves the Mar Thoma Church, the Church of the Lord Thomas. We can't verify that, but what we do know is that as far back as we can trace in that area that there are believers. So there were Christians in Asia as well as in Europe during that time. By the end of the apostolic era, we know that at the very least, the Christian faith had spread all over the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern and Central Mediterranean, and into Persia, and quite probably had gone as far as Spain as well, just in a very short period of time. The key, though, to understand here is that almost certainly this was a very small movement. There are some missiologists who will assert that there were large church planting movements in all these places. The evidence points in another direction. We know, for instance, that even though Paul had a very fruitful ministry in Ephesus, that 50 years after he had been there, Ephesus was still an overwhelmingly pagan city. The cult of Artemis of the Ephesians was still thriving. Idol-making was still thriving in that area. What seems to be the case fits more with the parables of Jesus. This was the mustard seed. This was a little bit of leaven. This was a small, scattered movement that still remained closely in connection with one another, sharing the gospel. The centuries that followed then saw that tiny movement explode until it overthrew the ancient world. The gospel spread in a variety of ways. There were missionary bishops like Irenaeus, who moved to Lyon in southern France. Gregory Thaumaturgus, who was the Bishop of Pontus, the north coast of what is now Turkey. It is said that when he moved to his area, there were 17 Christians, and when he died, there were 17 pagans. And so we have there the dramatic spread of the gospel among those folks. As the gospel is spreading in the Greek world, this fundamentally Hebrew faith spreading in the Greek world, we have the missionary issue of contextualization showing up. And we don't think of it by those terms because we think of contextualization as being what happens today on the mission field. But in fact, a fair bit of the New Testament is an exercise in contextualization. For instance, if you have believers from two different backgrounds and they have conflicting customs, how do you maintain the unity of the church in the light of those conflicting customs? For the answer, read Acts chapter 15. That's what they were wrestling with. You have thought categories. You have philosophical notions. How do you express a faith that holds that the material world is good and that God became a man in a philosophical setting culturally that says the material world is bad and there has to be distance, even a whole series of emanations separating a good God from the physical world? And so the whole wrestling with the nature and identity of Christ that starts in the New Testament and that climaxes based on what the apostles said in the great church councils of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries is all an expression of this missiological issue. How do I contextualize the gospel from biblical culture to a pagan Greek culture? So all of this is just an indication that the gospel is proving its power to be at home transformingly in a broad variety of cultures, but that the vehicles of the gospel, the missionaries who are taking it, have hard work to do, thinking through how do I express the gospel in this setting in a way that will fulfill two criteria. The first and most important criterion is it must be faithful to Scripture. But if I'm interested in evangelism, the other criterion is they understand it. So it has to be faithful to Scripture and understandable at the same time. And those are the issues of contextualization. Let me add, just as a principle here, seeing the example of the apostles, the goal of contextualization is clarity and not comfort. The goal is not to make the gospel comfortable to fallen human beings. It's to make it clear to fallen human beings so that the offense of the gospel is the offense of the cross and not the offense of foreignness or just the muddle of non-comprehension. As we look at these first 3 centuries of the church, and we realize that during this time, the gospel had spread over the entire Roman Empire. It had also spread over the entire Persian Empire, an area we don't think so much about, but that included not only modern-day Iran, but most of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. The gospel had spread through all that area. It had also spread into Armenia. It almost certainly had spread to Ethiopia, and it had spread to South India during these centuries. And you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? Think about the circumstances under which they labored. They did not have any form of economic advantage. Christians, by and large, were poor. They tended to be in the lower sectors of society. They certainly weren't richer than the people they were going to, as has so often been the case in the modern missionary movement. They had no technological advantages. In fact, they had no technology. They had no communications advantages. They had, basically, humanly speaking, nothing going for them. So what enabled the Christian message not only to spread, but to, in fact, overturn so much of the ancient world? There are 7 factors that we've identified, and I'm very grateful to Dr. Walters for articulating these and sort of putting them in order. The first is the burning conviction of the earliest believers. The gospel spread because they believed it, and they believed it enough to be willing to die for it. And there is a direct correlation between the vitality of faith and the effectiveness of missionary service. The second was their purity of life in a pagan, immoral society. You know, they weren't coming at it as much of Western Christianity is, where we once were the moral dominant factor and now we're seeing it slip away. It was the opposite for them. They were in a horribly pagan society, in a horribly immoral society, and they were starkly different. And I will simply say that one of the difficulties that we face on the mission field is the fact that to outside observers, Christians in America are not morally distinguishable from the rest of society. And so I actually had someone ask me once, it was a Muslim mullah, when he found out that I was a Baptist pastor, asked me in all sincerity, well, now, as a pastor, are you allowed to have sex with anybody you want to, just like other Christians can? Because that was his perception of Christianity. Because America is a Christian country, and you can't look at this country and see a stark, clear difference, contrast between the behavior of Christians and the behavior of nominal Christians and unbelievers. That was the case in the ancient world. Believers were stunningly and visibly pure in an evil society. A third factor is that they helped people. They engaged in widespread social service. Julian the Apostate was famously known for saying, they not only take care of their own widows and orphans, they take care of ours as well. And this compassion, this manifestation of compassion, commended the gospel to ancient society. The fourth factor was an inclusiveness of all races and social classes. When you have a multi-ethnic and even multinational society, you tend to have fragmentation along ethnic lines, and you tend to have the rise of ethnic tensions. What the gospel did was break down those barriers. And in the churches of the ancient world, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female were one. And that was a testimony to the power of the gospel to an increasingly fragmented Roman world. Going along with that was the close-knit community of the church in a chaotic and alienated society. The church was family to one another, and people yearned for that. Sixth was a willingness to endure persecution and a very gracious response to it when it happened. A willingness to suffer is an indispensable component to the spread of the gospel. And the early church never even thought about it. I mean, it was just automatic. This is part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. This is certainly part of what it means to spread the gospel to those who have never heard it. They were not only willing to face persecution and suffering, but when they were persecuted, they obeyed the words of Jesus, and they blessed those who persecuted them. They responded graciously to those who did harm to them. And there are stories of Roman soldiers converting as they were in the process of executing Christians because of the way they saw those Christians respond lovingly and graciously to those who are actually in the process of killing them. And then obviously the seventh factor, which is the most important, is the power and the presence of the Holy Spirit. Ultimately, we have to give the glory to God for the spread of the gospel so dramatically during that time. All these factors together, by the time Constantine converted, Christians constituted a large portion of the Roman Empire, the majority in some areas, and a force to be reckoned with. Now, as we study church history in the West, we tend to focus on the West, and we tend to think primarily in terms of what happened with our ancestors. And so it feels to us like there's this sort of gospel trajectory, and it starts in Jerusalem, and then it moves to Antioch, and it moves to Asia Minor, and it moves to Rome, and it moves to England, and then it finally moves to America, which is the Holy and Promised Land, because that's where we live. We just sort of think of the gospel going that way, and then assume, oh yeah, and in the modern era it started going other places as well. In reality, historically speaking, the Christian faith was more dramatically present in the East than it was in the West for centuries. Certainly the apostles went both ways. We've already talked about the fact that Thomas is reported to have gone to Iran and on down to India. But there were other missionaries who spread out. That city of Edessa that I mentioned earlier, modern-day Şanlıurfa, actually became a missionary sending base into Asia. The Persian Empire had a huge Christian population in the face of astonishing persecution. We know, for instance, that there was a bishop in the city of Herat in Afghanistan by the year 150 AD. Samarkand on the Silk Road in modern-day Uzbekistan was the seat of an archbishop by the year 300. The gospel spread widely all over the Asian continent and twice penetrated China. It penetrated China in the 600s and then again in the 12 and 1300s. And the first time it spread there, it did so almost entirely as a result of missionary activity. Now, the second time was another pattern we'll begin to see. It was because of the Turco-Mongol conquest under Genghis Khan that it went back in, a model which I do not commend. But in the early days, it went as a result of missionary activity and apparently was a thriving force in China until a change of dynasty resulted in all foreign religions, in that case it meant Buddhism and Christianity, being expelled from China for a period of time. Probably until the year 1400, there were more people who called themselves Christians in Asia than there were in Europe. Now, they were never a majority. They never had state sponsorship. There's just a lot of people in Asia, and so a minority in Asia can be bigger than all of Europe quite easily. And that was the case for much of history during that time. It died, and it died dramatically, and there are a number of reasons why it died. Physically speaking, the collapse of Christianity in Asia is ascribed to the activity of a guy named Tamerlane, who was a descendant by marriage of Genghis Khan, and who was a Muslim, sought to wipe out Christianity and reduced Christianity in Asia from a thriving movement to a few small pockets in modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, along with South India. I think spiritually speaking, behind that, though, a more significant element is simply the loss of the gospel. That over time, the message of salvation by grace through faith in Jesus was replaced with a religion of rituals and ascetic practices. So that later in this period, we actually have a record of a Turkic chieftain in Central Asia who sent a letter to a bishop saying, "What do I need to do to become a Christian?" And the response was, "Here's the rituals you must keep, and here are the ascetic practices that you must adopt in your life, and that's what it means to be a Christian." There's not a hint of the gospel in the response. And so God was pleased to allow it to be taken out because the gospel itself was no longer being proclaimed. The fact remains that there was for a time a vital movement, and that much of what happened in the spread of the Christian faith in Asia occurred not only because of traditional missionaries, but even more as an expression of business's mission. That much of the spread of Eastern Christianity came because of Christian merchants traveling along the Silk Road who would share their faith everywhere they went and leave behind churches. And so we have a centuries-long picture of the success and fruitfulness of business's mission during that time. It also, though, stands as a warning to us as we look at church history. Now, when we talk about church history, we're talking about the progress of an institution that called itself the Christian church. We're not necessarily talking about the spread of the gospel. And so we have to recognize that at times God seems to have been pleased to preserve an institution that had very little gospel in it for the sake of keeping the Word of God around for the leavening effect it would have later on. So as we look particularly at the spread of Christianity in Europe after Constantine converted in the early 300s, what we see is that sort of institutional spread with only sporadic pockets of gospel inside it. The Roman Empire became officially Christian in the 4th century. At first, that simply meant that Christianity was tolerated. By the end of the 3rd century, it was established by law, and non-Christian faiths were outlawed. But this was also the time when the Roman Empire was collapsing. Barbarians were sweeping in from the north. Many of these barbarians had been reached by missionaries who were Arians. And if you remember your historical theology, that meant they didn't believe Jesus was really God. And obviously this is not an orthodox form of Christianity. And for centuries it looked like the Arians would win because they had the political power involved in all of this. Over time you have some bold missionaries who took Christian faith in places where it was dangerous to do so. Some of the classic examples of that would be St. Patrick, who lived between 389 and 461, who took the gospel to Ireland after being taken there as a slave and escaping. You have people like St. Columba, who founded a monastery that was a center of missionary activity on the island of Iona between Ireland and Scotland. You have Columban and Iden and Willibrord and Winfrith and great names of missionary boldness who, at risk to their own lives, took the knowledge of Jesus among those who were hostile to it and who had a habit of pillaging monasteries and killing Christians. All of this, I believe, these are valid examples of the spread of the faith. But unfortunately, you also have the military spread of the Christian faith. Famous figure in history is Charlemagne, who lived in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. He is known for sort of restoring order to the chaos of Europe, but he also gives the classic model of the way not to Christianize a people. So Charlemagne conquered the Saxons in what is now Germany. And he decided that now that you're conquered and you're under my rule, you are all Christians. Well, how are we going to accomplish this? We've got a whole lot of you. How are we going to make you all Christians? So he put priests in trees with buckets of water and had the Saxon army run through the trees. And as they were running through, the priests were just tipping the water and saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's how the Saxons became Christians. So how Christian do you think they were as a result of that? And this, in many ways, is the foundation of European Christian nominalism, because much of it was fixed with the idea that there is a unity between political affiliation and religious affiliation. If you're in my kingdom, then you have my religion, and you are going to practice my religion by force. And eventually it becomes habit, but it's never a matter of personal faith. The gospel also continued to spread into the Slavic world, but here again, it's interesting how some of this happened. So this guy named Cyril, another guy named Methodius, were Greek Orthodox missionaries to the Slavic world. They created the alphabet used for Slavic languages. It was Cyril who did it, so it's known as the Cyrillic script. It was always amusing to me that even the atheist Soviets tried to spread the knowledge of the Cyrillic script, named after a missionary. But as it was spreading in the Slavic world, the most powerful of the princes of that area was a guy named Vladimir of Kiev, and he decided his people needed a religion. So he sent out emissaries. He sent one to Central Asia to study Islam. They came back and said, all we heard was a mournful sound and a certain obnoxious smell. Okay, we're not going to go that way. Sent one to Rome. They said, this is better. It was kind of nice. Okay. Sent another set of emissaries to Constantinople, and they went into Hagia Sophia Cathedral during the Mass, and they came back and said, it was so beautiful, we didn't know whether we were in heaven or on earth. And on that basis, Vladimir of Kiev decreed that all Russians are now Eastern Orthodox. So it was chosen on aesthetic grounds. It was the prettiest of all the religions. And it was then imposed by political fiat. You are now all Eastern Orthodox Christians. So we have here examples of the gospel spreading through missionary activity at high risk, but we also see the mixture of political imposition with missionary activity that was not helpful at all. Now, into all of this mix, another factor came that almost wiped Christianity out, and that was the rise of Islam. You will remember that up through the year 600, the Middle East was a Christian area. That countries like Egypt and Libya, Syria, Palestine were 100% Christian, in name at least. There was a variety of theologies. There were heretical groups that were vying for power, but they would all have called themselves Christians. Islam burst out of Arabia after the death of Muhammad in 632 and quickly conquered much of that area. I mean, it was rapid-fire conquest. Within a couple of decades, everything in the Middle East outside of modern-day Turkey had fallen to the forces of Islam, including the entire Persian Empire, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. Egypt fell quickly. Within the next 100 years, they took all of North Africa, which again had been a hotbed of Christianity. St. Augustine was from North Africa. Invaded Spain in the year, I believe it was 710, and by 732, 100 years after the death of Muhammad, were all the way into France. where they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours by Charlemagne's grandfather. And so at that point, you have Islam from southern France, Spain, across North Africa, the whole Middle East, well into Central Asia, and to the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan. And nothing seemed to be in a position to stop them. Over the next few hundred years, they managed to subjugate the Byzantine Empire, take all of modern-day Turkey. The Mongols, after they invaded, some of them converted to Islam and imposed Islam on parts of modern-day Russia, and even invaded into Europe from that direction. The Ottoman Turks invaded Europe through the Balkans and actually got as far as Vienna twice in the early 1500s and late 1600s. And Christianity was surrounded by and embattled in the face of Islam for centuries. And for centuries, every battle between Christians and Muslims was initiated by the Muslims and won by the Muslims. And the Christians seemed destined at best simply to be a minority group in an Islamic world. It was only beginning really in the 1400s that the tide started turning significantly. The Spanish managed to reassert themselves within Spain over a period of 700 years, the period known in Spanish history as the Reconquista. They reestablished rule over themselves, expelled the last of the Muslims in 1492, which freed up resources and attention to go into some harebrained scheme by this Italian guy to try and find India by sailing west from Spain, a guy named Cristobal Colombo, known to us as Christopher Columbus. There is no mistake that that voyage happened the year that the last Muslim enclave in Spain fell to the Spanish forces. In the East, things continued to go rather badly for a few centuries more. It was only after the Second Siege of Vienna in the 1680s that the Christian powers, in military fashion, began pushing the Muslim powers out of Europe and reasserting control. But what this meant was that for most of that time, literally Christians couldn't get out of Europe, except for those who were already in Asia, and we've already discussed their totally separate history, their rise and decline. Western Christianity was stuck in Europe. All of that changed when the Portuguese discovered the sea route around Africa, which was within a few years of the Spanish discovering the New World through Christopher Columbus. And in the early days of the modern era, most missionary activity was on the part of Roman Catholics. So again, this is spreading institutional churchness, not necessarily spreading the gospel. There were missionary orders like the Dominicans and the Jesuits. The colonial powers of Spain and Portugal actually got the Pope to divide the world between themselves, drew a line. When the line was drawn, they didn't know that Brazil existed, and it was actually intended to be a line over in the East Indies, so that it turned out that that line cut off Brazil from the rest of South America, which is why to this day the Brazilians speak Portuguese and most of the rest of Latin America speaks Spanish. It's because of a papal decision of that day. The Portuguese were very active in places like India, where they actually subjugated the ancient Thomas Christians and forced many of them to become Roman Catholic. They spread into modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia. There is a Portuguese colony 2 hours from where I now live that is now part of Malaysia, but for centuries was a Portuguese trading outpost. They even got Portuguese missionaries as far as Japan in those days. At the same time, then, the Spanish were busy conquering Latin America, and as they conquered it, they forcibly Catholicized it. Again, because of that weird line, and people not realizing, okay, it's going to go in a circle all the way around the globe, the Portuguese had authority to Christianize, colonize, and exploit most of Asia, but one bit of it was a bit further to the east, called the Philippines, and that fell then under Spanish jurisdiction, and so that was conquered by the Spanish and forcibly Catholicized. Through all of these things, we have significant activity, missionary activity, on the part of the Roman Catholics as the Reformation is breaking out and spreading in Europe. And one of the criticisms that the Catholic Church launched against the Protestants was to be a real Christian is to be involved in missions. We are and you're not. That's an indication that we're a true church and you aren't. All right, particularly those of you who live here in Louisville know the name Bellarmine. There's a Bellarmine University here in Louisville that's named after Robert Bellarmine, who was a Roman Catholic apologist against the Reformation. And he was the one who articulated that a lack of missions was a mark that Protestants could not be the true church and that Rome must be. Because during those days, Protestants were embattled in Western Europe, the Catholics were all over the place. And yet, I want to make the point that the Reformation was not as negative toward missions as it's often thought. Our colleague Michael Haken has recently published a book on the missionary vision and passion of John Calvin. Most people are aware that Calvin sent missionary preachers into France at great personal risk. Fewer are aware of the fact that he also sent them to Brazil, where they were killed by the Catholic authorities. Even though hemmed in by Roman Catholicism, they certainly were very active in evangelizing within Europe, which was going on at a significant pace, and as much as they were able, trying to get out from the chokehold of the Roman Catholic Church to be able to take the gospel to other places. Now, it is said and thought often that it was the reformers who articulated the idea that the Great Commission was fulfilled by the apostles and so no longer binding on us. Actually, the classic formulation of that came 100 years after the Reformation. A guy named Johann Gerhardt, who said that the Great Commission had been fulfilled, therefore, that the gospel had gone to the ends of the earth, therefore we didn't have to. Even as he was saying it, though, the absurdity of the statement was becoming evident to a lot of people, and no one more so than the Puritans who came to North America. It was very clear that whatever had happened in the apostolic period, no one seriously thought that any apostles had crossed the Atlantic and come over to the Americas. And as the Puritans settled in New England, they're confronted by Indian peoples who have no knowledge of Jesus. And their theology said, who are therefore going to hell without any hope of salvation apart from Jesus. John Eliot was the pastor of Roxbury in what is now Boston in the 1600s. It's curious, Roxbury is now one of the most economically depressed areas of Boston. At the time, it was a separate town. He developed a passion for the Indians around him, and while remaining pastor of that church, learned local Indian languages, reduced them to writing, started the translation of the Bible into their languages. At one point, all of his work was destroyed, and he had to start all over again, did so. He published the Mohican New Testament in 1661 and the Old Testament in 1663. And by the time he died in 1690, there were 3,600 American Indian followers of Jesus in Massachusetts as a result of his activity. The Mayhews in Martha's Vineyard did the same thing. It's a little backwards from what you normally think of. It was actually the son who started the work, and when he died, his father picked it up and continued with it, but also saw the evangelization of the Indians in those areas. This trend continued with people like David Brainerd, who was already mentioned, and Jonathan Edwards, who continued the work. After Jonathan Edwards was fired by his church in Northampton, he went to do missionary activity among the Indians until he was called to be president of what is now Princeton University. But we have evidences through these that even through the period of Protestant scholasticism, when your histories will tell you the Protestants were not interested in mission work, they were doing it. And they were doing it as they found themselves face to face with unbelievers, and they shared the gospel and saw significant fruit for the gospel. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the rise of Pietism also saw a rise in missionary activity. The first missionaries to go out from Europe to Asia were part of the Danish Halle mission. This is a Danish-German consortium, as it were, who sent two of my favorite missionary names to India, Bartholomew Ziegenbalg and Henry Plutchow. So I'm just dying for one of you guys to have a son and named him Ziegenbalg Plutchow, whatever your last name is. It would be a noble heritage to maintain. They left Europe in 1705, arrived in South India in 1706, and they had thought through their missiology. And so one of the earliest statements of missiological principles from Protestants we have is from these German and Danish Lutherans who said church and school must go together because we want to be able to teach the people to read the Bible. The scriptures must be available in a people's language, something the Catholics had obviously not been concerned about. Preaching must be based on an accurate knowledge of the mind of the people. And so they took the controversial step for the day of studying Hinduism, of studying a non-Christian religion. Up to that point, that was considered a bad thing for a Christian to do. It's wrong, so we just won't study it. They said, we got to know what these people are thinking. We got to understand their mindset. So they set out to study the pagan religions of the people that they were trying to evangelize. That the aim must be definite and personal conversion. Remember that much of the conversion of Europe had been mass conversion under political pressure. They said, no, that's not going to cut it. What we need is definite personal conversion, individuals coming to Christ through personal faith. And then finally, that as early as possible, an indigenous church must arise. And they began articulating the principles of empowering the local church to be the church without foreign domination from the very start. It was a slow start. Ziegenbalg lasted for 13 years, and they saw about 350 Indians come to Jesus in that 13 years. So certainly not a huge thing, but it was a start. Meanwhile, connected somewhat with that, the Moravians embarked on missionary activity. The Moravians are actually Protestants from the area we know of as the Czech Republic. They were descended from the followers of Jan Hus from the early 1400s. During the 30 Years' War, they were bitterly persecuted. Many of them fled to Germany. And a German nobleman named Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, another great name. So you could have somebody whose name was Ziegenbalg Zinzendorf. That'd be another good name. He opened up one of his estates to them. They settled there and founded a place called Herrnhut. And out of Herrnhut, they began sending missionaries and started a missionary prayer meeting that lasted without a break, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 100 years. 100 years of continuous prayer for missions. They sent missionaries to Greenland, to the West Indies, and at times they had to experiment with means of missionary support since these guys were refugees. So there were actually Moravians who sold themselves into indentured servanthood in order to take the gospel to the West Indies. They valued the gospel more than their own freedom and were willing to do that as a way of support. So all of those are examples of Protestant missionary activity prior to the Great Century. But things really blew up at the end of the 1700s. It is said by secular historians that the 19th century began in 1789 and ended in 1914. It began with the French Revolution, ended with the outbreak of World War I. The great century of missionary activities began in 1792 with Carey and ended in 1910 with the Edinburgh Missions Conference. At the beginning of that time, Protestant Christianity was still largely confined to northwestern Europe and the Atlantic coast of North America. Few tiny outposts like South India, but hardly anything at all. By the end of that time, Protestant Christianity was literally all over the globe. When Carey first embraced the call to missions, it was considered crazy. By the end of that time, it was considered an expected and normal part of Protestant Christian life. Now, William Carey is a figure worth knowing about. Carey was a cobbler. That means he's a shoe repairman. He was a Baptist and therefore was not allowed to go to university. In England in those days, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you could not get a university education. So he was entirely self-educated. His wife, Dorothy, was illiterate and went crazy in India. He was a bivocational pastor, repairing shoes to support himself while also pastoring a small Baptist church. He was living in an environment where many, following up on what they had heard from Gerhardt, were saying the Great Commission was fulfilled, therefore Christians don't have an obligation to do anything about the evangelization of the heathen. So in 1792, he wrote a booklet whose short title was An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. This is common in those days. Then it would be followed by or and something about a paragraph long. That was a normal title. So it's really great because that meant the title of a book was an executive summary. It was really helpful for deciding what you wanted to read. He put together his research entirely sitting at his cobbler's bench, but gathering what he could. Remember, there was no internet, there were no public libraries. He had no access to any of the research tools that you all use so diligently when writing your papers for seminary classes. He put this thing together. It included an exegesis of Matthew 28, which he demonstrated that there's no way we could say that it was exclusively reserved for the apostles or that it had been fulfilled in the day of the apostles. And one of his arguments, by the way, is we use that as a warrant for baptism. So if it's been fulfilled and we can't do missions, we can't baptize either. Which, talking to a bunch of Baptists, you just don't say that without causing some consternation. He preached a sermon to the Baptist Ministerial Association in the county of Nottingham. So expect great things, attempt great things. It's often remembered as expect great things for God, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. That from and for God part was not probably actually part of his title, but it stirred things up. And the very next day, the Baptist Missionary Society was formed. That was in 92. In 1793, he went to India with his wife, who initially did not want to go at all. And as I mentioned, she went crazy after they got to India. When he got to India, it was under the control of the Dutch East Indies Company, and he was not allowed to settle on British territory. Far from there being a wedding of colonial expansionism and missionary activity, many of the early colonial companies like the British or Dutch East Indies Company were actually opposed to the spread of Christianity. They didn't want anything that would interfere with their profits, and they were afraid that missionary activity would stir up the local population, cause them trouble. So they actually said Carey could not settle in British India. Fortunately, there were areas nearby under Danish control, and those were the places that he was able to be. He went 7 years without seeing his first convert. After 7 years, again, in Krishna Paul came to faith in the year 1800. That was also the year that he finally got a team. And Joshua and Hannah Marshman and a single guy named William Ward arrived. The three units, two couples and a single, constituted themselves as a church, established an agreement on how they would work together called the Serampore Compact, which I would strongly urge you to look up and read. Another early statement of Protestant missiological thinking, an articulation of a philosophy of missions that ties it intimately to the local church. You notice we're not in England anymore. We're here. We're believers. We need a church. The only believers around us are our team, so we constitute as a church and take it seriously and formalize it in that way. Carey, who was entirely self-educated, never been to university, translated the entire Bible into Bengali, Sanskrit, and Marathi, 3 different languages, was involved in many other translations, and ended up being asked, ironically, to be a professor of Oriental languages at a British college in Calcutta. Remember, in Britain, he wouldn't be allowed to attend a university. Over here, he's invited to be a professor at a university, having no degrees of any sort whatsoever. So Professor Carey was not only not Dr. Carey, he didn't even have a bachelor's degree. He was just brilliant and self-taught. In 1812, a warehouse fire destroyed all of his translation work, and he did it all over. He had actually 2 wives, 3 wives total after Dorothy died, and he died in 1834, and they had seen hundreds of Indians come to faith and had established the Bible in multiple languages at that time. For us here in the United States, the first foreign missionaries sent out were Adoniram and Ann Judson and Luther Rice. They were sent by the Congregationalists in 1812 to go to India to work with the Careys. Well, they thought, we're going to be working with this Baptist guy. He's going to try and convert us to being Baptists. We need to bone up on the biblical basis of infant baptism. So Adoniram Judson studied his Bible to prepare himself to debate baptism with William Carey. And by the time he landed, he was a Baptist. He was actually baptized in Calcutta after he arrived. Because he was sent by the Congregationalists, he said, there's a little lack of integrity here if I keep taking their money when I'm not one of them anymore. So they sent the single man, Luther Rice, back to America with their letters of resignation and to find somebody to support them. So Baptists we had our first missionary before we had our first mission agency. And it was the presence, suddenly discovering we have a missionary in Asia that we didn't even know we had. We better do something about it. That was the beginning of denominational life among Baptists in North America. That quickly led to the Triennial Convention, which was Baptists all over the United States. And then in 1845, the Triennial Convention split, and there were the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists began at that point. But Judson went 8 years in Burma without seeing his first convert. Again, the same pattern was repeating itself. He ended up having 3 wives because the first 2 died. He translated the Bible into the Burmese language and saw a major people movement among some of the tribal groups, not the Buddhist Burmese themselves, but some of the animist tribal groups, particularly the Karen around them. The first Protestant missionary to China was an English Congregationalist named Robert Morrison, who only saw 12 converts his entire career, and the first, again, after 7 years, but translated the Bible into Chinese in 1823. One of the most famous of the early missionaries was a man named Henry Martin, who died when he was 29 years old. No, 31, excuse me, died when he was 31 years old. He translated the Bible into Urdu. He revised a Persian translation of the Bible, began working on revising the Arabic translation. He was an Anglican, but worked closely with the Baptists, and remains a revered figure in the spread of Christianity in the Middle East and South Asia to this day. All of these guys are simply examples of the pioneering missionaries of the beginning of the modern missionary movement. When it started, not only was Europe not in control of most of the world, but the gospel was not in most places. Over the course of about the first half of the 19th century, we see a consistent pattern of missionary activity, taking the gospel where it has never been heard before, primarily along the coastlands of Africa and Asia. And so Ralph Winter sort of created a taxonomy of mission activity that the first phase, the first wave of Protestant mission work was to the coastlands. Then about the middle of the 19th century, people began to realize, okay, we're on the coast, but that's as far as we've gone. Now think about their situation. How did you get somewhere outside your own country in those days? It was by ship. You would go by ship. Where do ships land? On the coast. If you're over there and you need supplies, how are they going to get to you? By ship to the coast. If things get hairy and you need to be evacuated, how do you get out? By ship from the coast. And so it felt very natural to go, it was natural to go first to the coasts and comfortable to stay on the coasts. In the middle of the 19th century, people began saying we need to take the gospel inland. One of the most famous examples of that was a guy named Hudson Taylor, who founded the China Inland Mission. They were founded in 1865, and by 1882, they had missionaries in every province of China. They also were controversial because they insisted that missionaries identify as much as possible with the Chinese people. Remember that in the 19th century, Western culture regarded itself as culturally superior to the rest of the world. And so typically you took Christianity and Western civilization hand in hand. And you have pictures of Western missionaries in tropical Africa in three-piece suits and hats. You just go, you're crazy. But that's what you did because you were taking civilization there. He made his missionaries dress like the Chinese. He made them eat Chinese food. He made them make themselves as much at home in Chinese culture as they could without sacrificing biblical principles. This then was part of another sort of wave of missiology. So we have to the inlands, and from that came mission agencies like the China Inland Mission, which is now Overseas Missionary Fellowship, the Africa Interior Mission, the Sudan Africa Inland Mission, the Sudan Interior Mission, all of these have in their names this idea, let's leave the safety of the coasts and take the gospel inland to where the people are. And this was also a period of time in which principles of indigenization are rising to the surface. The realization that Christianity and Western civilization are not one and the same thing. And so you have names like Henry Venn with the Church Missionary Society, which is Church of England. Rufus Anderson, who was an American Congregationalist. John Nevius, who was a Presbyterian, worked first in China and then in Korea. And most famously, Roland Allen, who was a British Anglican who worked in China and who wrote in 1912 the book Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours, that he himself said would go unread for half a century, and it did. For about half a century, what he wrote was ignored, and then it was like a bomb blowing up on the playground. It just has radicalized the way people have understood missions ever since, essentially contending that missionaries should not keep control or finances in their hands, that indigenous churches can and must be empowered with control over those things, and that the health of the church and the spread of the gospel is dependent on releasing control of those things to the indigenous church. Remember, this principle was articulated by Ziegenbalg and Plutchow back in South India in the early 1700s, the idea that an indigenous church should emerge. But over and over again, what you had were examples of missionaries starting churches that they pastored from then on, funded by foreign funds, foreign-built buildings, and the expectation was the natives just sit in the pews and absorb. Leadership and ministry activity is in the hands of the wealthy, educated, white Westerners. And that became so much the dominant pattern that people like Anderson and Nevius and Roland Allen said, no, that's unbiblical and unhealthy for the church. Well, meanwhile, let's sort of step back for a minute and think about our own heritage. As Southern Baptists, how did we get on the field? How did we end up where we are? Well, the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in 1845. We have, I am grateful to say, officially repented of why we were founded, because we were founded to defend our right to take slaves to the mission field. We say it was for the sake of missions, and it was. We were involved in missions. What was becoming clear was that the Triennial Convention, whose domestic mission board was based in Boston, would not appoint slaveholders to be domestic missionaries. And so we formed a separate convention so that slaveholders could be appointed as domestic missionaries. In 1995, as a convention, we formally repented of that, of the establishment of our denomination to defend slavery. The first two institutions that we created were a foreign mission board and a board of domestic missions. Immediately, those missionaries with the Triennial Convention who were from Southern churches found themselves no longer supported by the Triennial Convention. And so once again, we started a mission agency with missionaries already on the field, predominantly in China. That's where we started from. We almost immediately opened up work in Liberia in 1896 on the coast of West Africa. We entered Nigeria in 1850. We entered Brazil in 1881, and these were sort of the new works. But from the start, China was the biggest field. And if you go to Richmond and you see some of the posters, they have these posters showing pictures of all the missionaries with a foreign mission board. And they're grouped by country. And the biggest bunch is China, and then there's other places. They also began work in Italy. The problem, of course, was that we were founded in 1845, and in 1861, the Civil War broke out and devastated the South. And the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention was in debt from the Civil War until World War II. It was not until the 1940s that they finally got out of debt. They were struggling to survive. They weren't a huge missions agency. You could put the pictures of all Southern Baptist missionaries on a poster that would easily fit on a normal-sized wall. In fact, by far the largest mission agency for many years was the China Inland Mission. But still, some incredible things happened. One of the most famous figures is Lottie Moon, appointed to China in 1873. An example, by the way, of one fairly radical thing that had been also adopted by the China Inland Mission, a willingness to send single women to the mission field. In the early 1800s, that was considered totally unacceptable. You were putting them at too much risk. How could they do anything? and we began sending women, and they did incredible work. Now, we need to face up to this. I'm a complementarian. We were a complementarian school. Lottie Moon planted 30 churches around the area where she was. But what she always said is, I'm planting these churches because there are no guys. Where are the guys? And she would send appeals saying, send me men. I need men. I'm sharing the gospel. I'm not going to stop sharing the gospel just because there are no men here, but we need men. Where are they? And that has been a recurring theme down to this day. To this day, single women outnumber single men 2-to-1 with the International Mission Board. So as an early experience of that, she had a friend named Annie Armstrong. Annie Armstrong was involved in the formation of the Woman's Missionary Union in 1888. Lottie Moon suggested to Annie Armstrong that they take up an offering for missions at Christmas time that would help to support the work of the Foreign Mission Board. When Lottie Moon died in 1912 on a ship on her way to Japan because she had been giving away her food to starving Chinese as a result of a famine, the decision was made to rename the offering after her. So to this day, we have the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Now, it can get kind of amusing with people who aren't from a Southern Baptist background. Because I grew up Southern Baptist, I have known about St. Lottie my whole life. It is just, that's part of common vocabulary. The Lottie Moon Christmas offering is going to come around in December. I've been aware of people in pioneering areas who have either asked, why in the world are we supporting the Moonies? Why do we take an offering for the Moonies every Christmas? Or, who is this woman? How much do we owe her, and when can we pay her off? And the answer is, we will pay off the debt when Jesus comes back. Meanwhile, still in those days in Southern Baptist mission life, you had this offering, but the Foreign Mission Board and the Home Mission Board had to individually raise support from churches. And so they would go around to churches making appeals. Churches would give or not give in varying amounts. And in the 1920s, Southern Baptists decided that wasn't a great way to go about it and established the cooperative program whereby churches give to their state conventions. The state conventions keep a portion of it, send the rest on. By the way, the average nationally is that the state conventions keep 65% of cooperative program dollars and send 35% on to Nashville to the executive committee to divide among all the Southern Baptist boards and agencies. I'm proud to say that Kentucky is at 50-50, and that is a result of the leadership of Paul Chitwood, who became executive director in 2011, and that very same year, our own Adam Greenway was elected as president of the convention, and they moved quite quickly to a 50-50 split. Nationally, the average is 65-35. But then that money that landed in the executive committee was divided among the various boards and agencies. That's how Southern Seminary is supported, and this was the first of the seminaries. 50% of what reaches Nashville goes to the Foreign Mission Board. So that, in fact, the way it averages out is if you give $1 to the cooperative program, 17.5 cents makes it to the International Mission Board. But that was still a fantastic support mechanism, far ahead of what most other people did. And after the debts were finally paid off at the end of World War II, it set the stage for dramatic expansion. So that from a small missions agency 100 years ago, the IMB has become, in my lifetime, the largest career mission agency in the world and is now spread all over the world. Things continue to develop. We continue to face new challenges. And perhaps one of the most significant challenges that has forced a restructuring of our mission work came with what you've already heard about. In 1974, Ralph Winter at the Lausanne Congress challenged the evangelical world with the reality and the priority of unreached people groups, with the fact that most of the lost people in the world were places where you couldn't go as a missionary and were in people groups with no witness to the gospel. That forced a reconsideration of mission strategy across the board. In the mid-1980s, the president of the IMB, Dr. Keith Parks, brought in an outside consultant to look at our organization and evaluate how we were doing in meeting our goals of evangelizing the world. His comment was, you not only are not going to meet your goals, you are structurally incapable of ever reaching your goals. And he pointed out that we only sent missionaries where they could go as missionaries, that only a field mission could generate a request, which meant we were structurally incapable of going anywhere new, that we had an administrative structure that basically was like Baptist church life in control of your whole life. Okay, so think about this. What if every element of your life was controlled by a church business meeting? Well, that's the way it was on the mission field. All the missionaries in a country constituted the mission. They met together once a year for a business meeting, and they voted on who could live in what house. There were even places where if you wanted to paint a room in your house a different color, it took a vote of the mission to authorize it. Who could drive what car, whose kids could go to what schools, and what projects were going to be funded, and what new missionary appointments were going to be approved from this once-a-year meeting. This structure made us really unable to start anything new at all. And so in the mid-'80s, the International Mission Board created a structure to explore how to do creative access mission work among unengaged, unreached people groups in restricted access nations. At the time that my wife and I first went overseas as part of this structure, we made up 2% of the force coming out of Southern Baptist churches. Today we are over 50% of that structure. But we went through a number of phases in all of that. At first it was just, gosh, we don't have a clue what to do, so we'll try everything, which is exciting but often perilous. Began to learn better and better how to be places in a solid and secure way, but at the same time be effective in sharing the gospel. So the last 25 years have seen some of the most dramatic expansion of the gospel in all of human history. Just to give you one example, I was, prior to coming here, the regional leader for Central Asia for the IMB. Our estimation is that out of 340 million Muslims, in 1990, there were 4,000 Christians. Do any of you belong to churches with more than 4,000 members? Anybody in this room belong to a church with more than 4,000 members? Okay. So you have more members in your church than there were believers from Istanbul, Turkey to northwest China or from southern Russia to the Persian Gulf combined. Today, and all of the people groups in that area were unreached. All but maybe one or two were unengaged. Today, there are probably somewhere, and please, by the way, please do not tweet what I'm about to say, okay? Do not, for the safety of the people I'm about to talk about. But we estimate there's around 220,000 Christians in Central Asia from 4,000 20 years ago. And so what we have seen in that is that the issue is not that some people groups are resistant. Resistance is in some ways a theologically nonsensical statement. Who isn't resistant? Who's dead? You know, I mean, dead's dead. And according to Scripture, all people who are not regenerated are dead. And there are not degrees of dead. Dead people, as a general rule, do not contribute to their own resurrection. And an Afghan Muslim is no more dead than an American nominal Christian. Same level of dead, and God has the same power to save both places. The gospel has the same power both places. The reason there are people groups with no believers in them is that the church hasn't taken the gospel to them, period. That doesn't mean that you're going to instantly see an astonishing revival as soon as you set foot. Generally, as we've said, it's been a pattern of about sometimes 7 or 8 years before even the first convert has come. But I can tell you, at least within the parts of the world where I have worked, that without exception, every place we have gone, planted ourselves, learned the language, stayed and built relationships, without exception, we have seen fruit for the gospel. So the issue is not their resistance, the issue is our disobedience, pure and simple. And in our lifetime, we have seen the gospel taken more places than probably any other point in human history, certainly a more concentrated taking of it. So that today, the number of unengaged people groups has shrunk dramatically. It was way higher in days past. And the ones that remain are by and large the smaller people groups. So I think I mentioned last night when we were first appointed, we weren't allowed to look at any people group that had less than 10 million people in it. Today, we're very much in sort of looking at the smaller groups for future engagement. It still remains true that about half the people groups in the world are unengaged, and that those people groups make up about a third of the world's population. But the fact of the matter is that today, Christianity has become a worldwide religion. At least in every country, you're going to find Christians, and in so many more people groups than in the past. It is also true that today there are missionaries going out from areas that were mission fields just a generation ago. So that alongside of us, there are now missionaries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We have also seen in our day the decline of mainline Protestant missions, so that in fact, that missionary conference in 1910 in Edinburgh was ironically the founding meeting of what would become the World Council of Churches, which now is not involved in missions at all because they are not exclusivist regarding the gospel and so no longer feel the need to do that. But we have seen the rise of conservative mission agencies, including interdenominational groups. There aren't many players left from a denominational background. The major ones from a denominational background would be Southern Baptist, the Presbyterian Church in America, the Assemblies of God, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, the EPC, has people out there. The Conservative Baptists have people out there. But by and large, the large mainline Protestant denominations that have ceased to hold to evangelical theology have left the field when it comes to missions. But we have seen the gospel since my grandfather was born in the year 1900. The gospel has gone global in a stunning way. So we are on a trajectory. We're on a trajectory that has gone from the coastlands to the interior to the people groups. And that's what Ralph Winter has identified as sort of the third wave of missions, a focus on people groups. We have gone from, we only take the gospel where they would invite us to come as a missionary, to we must obey God rather than men. And if they won't let us in as a missionary, we'll find another way in. We have gone from a very unbiblical bifurcation between what is sacred and what is secular, so that we separated mission work from business and other normal work activities, to seeing business as mission as a major component of how we're going to get the gospel out. We have seen the Bible translated into more languages than even imaginable 100 years ago. And yet we still have a huge chunk of the task to finish. That's where we've come from. That's our family history. That's our heritage. But we are now at a point where still a third of the world has never heard the gospel. And all the peoples that are left are the hard ones. All the peoples that are left are the people you can't get to through normal means. And it's going to take both, it's going to take creativity, and it's going to take a willingness to suffer if we're going to accomplish the task.